While none are alive to recount the horrors that happened during World War I, we still have many stories, movies, and photographs to give us an idea of what had taken place. For some, however, there's much more tangible evidence, as certain areas of the land still bear the heavy scars and toxic substances polluting the soil to this day. Today, we'll be discussing one particular area in France, known as the Zone Rouge, or Red Zone, as well as a related topic known as the Iron Harvest. It's difficult to find accurate numbers on just how many shells were produced and used in the 4 short years that were the Great War, but the estimates vary wildly, anywhere between 900 million up to 1.5 billion, with some claiming even as high as 7 or 8 billion. It's estimated that France and Germany both had used anywhere between 400 to 600 million artillery shells each by the war's end, with a couple of articles stating that Britain had used approximately 170 to 175 million, with others claiming as high as 300 million. And with the United States' late inclusion to the war, there are more conservative estimates that as few as 50 million shells had been used, with the more agreed upon numbers being somewhere around 80 to 100 million. Furthermore, according to a 1937 assessment by a man named Augustin Prentice, it's estimated that there was approximately 66 million gas shells having been used throughout the war. And as per the book Steel Wind by David Zabecki, it cites the following. France in 1914 entered the war with a stockpile of shells numbering approximately 5 million, with Germany having a stockpile of approximately 20 million. With the first year of the war, France using approximately 900,000 shells per month, which, by the war's end, had been upscaled to 4.5 million per month, with Germany using almost twice as many at 8 million per month in 1918. Now, if we take that 4.5 million per month figure from France in 1918 and apply it for 4 years' worth, it still only equates to about 216 million, which is a far cry from the many claims citing 600 million for France. And if we do the same for Germany's stated figure of 8 million per month in the last year, then it would equate to approximately 384 million. Which is much closer to the lower estimate of 400 million. Now, to give a better idea of the sheer scope of this all, the picture shown here was taken by a photographer named Tom Aitken. The lone soldier present in this photograph is surrounded by hundreds, if not thousands of casings, which, even if we go with the most conservative estimates on how many shells were produced and fired throughout the entirety of the war, you would still need a fair few thousand more of these pictures to show just how many had been made and used. But regardless of just how many shells had actually been used, the true destructive nature of their use was greatly underestimated by all parties. And while accounts vary wildly, it's estimated that as many as 25 or even up to about 30% of all shells that had been fired had failed to detonate on impact. This included gas shells, which comprise about 2 to 5% of all the shells that were produced during this time. Now, with all this being said, this all leads me into the main topic, the Zone Rouge, and the Iron Harvest. The Zone Rouge is an area where some of the heaviest fighting took place between the French and German armies, an area that originally spanned more than 1,200 square kilometers, or about 460 square miles, of northeastern France, an area that, to this day, is still heavily scarred, intensely polluted, as well as dangerous due to the presence of unexploded ordnance. Much of this zone is polluted by a plethora of different contaminants, which include, but are not limited to, lead, which was used for bullets as well as in an alloy with antimony, which had been used in British shrapnel shells, mercury, which was used in artillery shells primarily as mercury fulminate, in detonators and in bullets as well as a primer. Chlorine, which was used in chemical warfare as gas weapons, originally by the Germans, until the French and the British also adopted this tactic. Arsenic, which was used in munitions as an arsenical alloy for use in shells, as well as being part of different chemical weapons used, such as ethyl dichloroarsine, or diphenylchloroarsine. You also had zinc and copper, both of which were used for various parts of munitions, such as for driving bands or fuses, or for casings, and as well as a very well-known alloy, brass. This contamination that persists to this day still has a very present day-to-day effect on the residents within northeastern France in the Pas-de-Calais and Nord regions. The groundwater in these areas of France have been restricted or even banned for use as of 2012 due to high amounts of arsenic and ammonium perchlorate present, which is affecting more than 500 communes. And as if that wasn't bad enough, even in areas that have had years of remediation, farmers have had to destroy their products as they were deemed unsafe by the French government, with one such instance happening in 2014. It also bears mentioning as well that France isn't the only country still affected by this issue. Belgium, namely near Ypres in West Flanders, also has a fair amount of pollution to contend with. Exempli Kratia, a study that was done in Ypres found that the average copper concentration in the soil was at 18 milligrams per kilogram per cubic meter, compared to 12 milligrams per cubic meter per kilogram found in other Belgian soils. Furthermore, Belgium also had ammunition destruction facilities, which had also polluted the nearby land with arsenic, lead, and copper, as well as nitroaromatic compounds such as nitrobenzene, as well as triphenylarsine. Unfortunately, Belgium also has the distinction of having experienced two of the most recent fatalities from UXO in 2014, when 2 construction workers had been killed. Additionally, in 2019, the Belgian Explosive Ordnance Disposal Group, or DOVO, had received at least 3,600 calls regarding historic ammunition discovered from both world wars. It had been reported via the Belgian Armed Forces website that well over 200 tons of ammunition had been neutralized and disposed of that very year. For contrast, it's reported that the French Department du Déminage, or Department of Mine Clearance, handles approximately 900 tons of material every year from farmers and construction works. This annual collection of unexploded ordnance is referred to as the Iron Harvest. In total, there have been over 1,000 casualties between both France and Belgium, with over 600 of those being fatal despite the numerous cleanup efforts that have taken place since the Great War. And now, one particular area of note within the Zone Rouge that I will be talking about has been polluted to an upper extreme. It is an area simply known as the Place Gas, or gas place. This area is covered in a blackened soil, of which has an average thickness between 5 to 20 centimeters, up to 40 centimeters at the center, and is heavily contaminated with arsenic, copper, lead, and zinc, all of which have concentrations up to 175,000, 16,000, 12,000, and 133,000 milligrams per kilogram, respectively, as well as high concentrations of cobalt, chromium, and nickel. The area is visibly lacking plant growth, with only a handful of lichens and mosses being able to survive the high amounts of pollution. The reason for the abnormally high concentrations of heavy metals is due to approximately 200,000 arsenical shells being improperly disposed of by burning them in open pits, of which many were cited as being Blue Cross or Blaukreuz, which would have contained diphenylchloroarsine, diphenylcyanoarsine, ethyl dichloroarsine, or methyl dichloroarsine in glass bottles. Additionally, to the east of this spot, nearer to Spaincourt, a company named Clair and Schwander, which had operated between 1919 to 1926, had 3 separate sites within Spaincourt where it had disposed of ammunition, 2 of which were using open burn and washout methods, with a 3rd site detonating the old munitions. It's estimated that Clair and Schwander had disposed of approximately 1.5 million shells, many of which were chemical weapons, and because of the company's improper disposal of ammunition, contaminated both the land and water, with the aforementioned crop destruction and water usage being banned being 2 consequences of this negligence. And due to the large quantity of munitions being destroyed at these sites, as well as it being stated that a large quantity of it was chemical weapons, it is plausible that some of these shells were Green Cross, which would have had payloads of chloropicrin, phosgene, or trichloromethylchloroformate, White Cross, which would have had a payload of bromobenzyl cyanide, bromomethylethyl ketone, chloroacetone, ethyl bromoacetate, or xylyl bromide, or Yellow Cross, which would have had a payload of mustard gas. Now, one thing I would also personally just like to emphasize is the location of the plazagas. Many things are claiming that this particular area in the Spaincore forest is the eponymous plazagas. However, as far as I can tell, it isn't. It might very well be polluted, and likely is. As previously stated, Spaincore itself had at least 3 spots where ammunition had been disposed of. But the place where plazagas, where many of the photos had been taken, as far as I've been able to find out by referring to satellite imagery, is in fact here, which is located west of Spaincore, which is also northeast of Verdun by about 20 kilometers. Now, it's been over 100 years since the Great War has ended, and it's estimated that it'll still take upwards of another 300 years for the Zone Rouge to be fully decontaminated at the current rate. Now, with all this having been said on the Zone Rouge and the after effects of World War I would like to direct the next part of the video to Ukraine. Why, might you ask, would I want to talk about Ukraine suddenly, when the rest of the video has been about World War I, France, and Belgium? Well, simply put, one of the reasons is the fact of what the war has done and is doing to Ukraine, as much of what's happening in Ukraine is relevant as to what has been talked about previously. And it does not seem like the majority of people are talking about the effects that this war will have on Ukraine in the future. Especially as much of the fighting within Ukraine has devolved from what was expected as a blitzkrieg that would only last a few days, to what is now a mockery of what people thought a modern war would be, with tactics harkening back to that of World War I or II, but now juxtaposed with modern equipment, such as drones. But I digress. Russia has been firing thousands of shells on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis. I have not been able to find any accurate estimates as to how many they have fired overall. Numbers of reports over the past 2 years have stated numbers anywhere between 10,000 per day to 20,000 per day, with estimates of Russia manufacturing somewhere in the ballpark of 250 grand per month, which would equate to about 3 million per year. But that's only for artillery shells. Russia has been using countless mines, with approximately 1/3 of the entire country having mines in it, with upwards of 2 million mines having been deployed throughout Ukraine. And much like northeastern France in the modern day still being affected by the mines in UXO still remaining there, Ukrainian civilians have been getting killed by the mines, with more than 1,000 civilians, some of whom were children, meeting an early grave, or, at best, having a permanent injury. Russia is using a plethora of mines, such as, but not limited to, the MOB, MON-50, 90, 100, or 200, the OZM-72, the PFM-1, the PMN-2 or 4, and the POM-2 or 3. Some of these mines can be deployed en masse through MLRS systems, such as the BM-27 Uragan or the BM-21 Grad, or even via helicopter, one of which is the PFM-1, which, apocryphally, resulted in a disproportionately large amount of casualties with children, as they could be mistaken for toys. The list doesn't stop there either, unfortunately. As we all know, Russia has also been using no small amount of missiles, such as the Kinzhal, or even foreign-made drones such as the Iranian Shahed 136, which, in the Russian military, has been designated as the Garan 2. And I haven't even mentioned the fact that Russia has now been getting shells from North Korea, so one can only presume the quality assurance of those, as well as their failure rate, And lastly, it also bears mentioning that there have been numerous reports of Russia having been using chemical weapons, of which 3 have been named from what I found. We have phenyl chloride, also known as CN gas, chlorobenzyl malonitrile, aka CS gas, and finally, chloropicrin, which is also known as nitrochloroform. CS gas is a fairly common riot-control tear gas, and is generally accepted as non-lethal. CN gas has also been used as a tear gas, but less often as it's more toxic, and less effective compared to CS. And lastly, chloropicrin is a chemical that has been used in farming as a fumigant. It's the most toxic of the 3, and has been used as a weapon before, in World War I, by the German army. And to make matters worse, Russia has performed ecocide by dumping waste into the same river, which flows into the Desna, and then into the Dnipro. This has contaminated the water with ammonia, magnesium, and nitrates, which has made the water completely inhospitable for life, with 44 tons of dead fish having been collected, and the water now being non-potable. The source of this pollution has been traced to the Russian village of Tyotkino. All of this has left much of Ukraine's land devastated, a large portion of which is arable land, or was. More than 10 million hectares have been affected, or about 38,000 square miles, which is just short of the state of Kentucky at 40,000. Ukraine's agricultural sector has suffered more than $6 billion in damages, and it's estimated that it'll cost upwards of $40 billion to rehabilitate and demine the land that has been affected. And sadly, even if the war were to end tomorrow, the reconstruction efforts will take years, if not decades. Much like how the Zone Rouge and the surrounding region still bear their scars more than 100 years later. No matter how much you rebuild, you can't bring back the dead.